Well, it's amazing to be able to catch up here in person and talk about some of the work that Kelvin and I have been doing this for
3-4 years?
5 actually.
5
years.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, and Dani's been involved for 2 or 3 in the development of the maths project. So, Kelvin, one of the questions that we get asked frequently is why concept-based maths over any other approach to teaching mathematics?
Yeah, and it's as you say, it's a common question and it's a good question. But actually, a concept-based approach to mathematics is the ideal approach because mathematics itself is a conceptual language. Unlike a lot of subjects, it doesn't have an awful amount of knowledge. And even the things that we call factual, like number facts, are in fact conceptual relationships. And so it's really important that we understand that mathematics is made of concepts. And the concepts are also strongly connected to each other. So when we develop a new concept in mathematics, we're actually building it on the basis of prior understandings. So for example, addition provides the conceptual basis for understanding multiplication as repeated addition. Likewise, multiplication provides the basis for understanding exponents or powers of numbers. It's referred to as a hierarchy of abstractions where each understanding is built on others and becomes progressively more abstract. That's what gives mathematics its power. But it does underline the fact that if we don't have conceptual understanding of a particular concept, then the next level up is inaccessible to us until we have learned that understanding. So understanding is paramount in mathematics. And in a concept-based approach, we're not only guiding the students systematically towards that understanding, but we're actually eliciting from them direct evidence of their understanding through asking them to generalize at the end of a set of learning engagements.
So, Dani, what have you learnt from your classroom experience, from your students, about the need to teach maths conceptually?
Yeah, so as a teacher of mathematics and having lots of conversations with other teachers of mathematics as well, in a primary school, we all have to teach maths. And one of the common conversations we have around the staff room table is it seems like they're coming in, they've never met these concepts before.
Yes.
And it's something that's completely new, even though we know that it's not. Yeah. So it's like all that really hard work that we did previously kind of just disappeared. And that's where concept-based inquiry mathematics is really important because it is about constructing understanding. And we're not doing learning to students, we're supporting students to, through the case studies that we choose and through the really intentional questions that we ask, to build their own understanding. And then we can see that transfer into other year levels, we can see the connections that they can make to other concepts as well. So the depth of their understanding is something that they're building and can take with them into the next year level. It also, I suppose, takes for us as teachers, we know where they've left off. So we know what the understanding was prior to our year level, and then we can keep building on that.
Yeah, that's the absolute power of having that scope and sequence that's articulated as a progression for the school.
Yeah.
So that we can kind of go back, we can see, sometimes we can see if they've missed something, if we need to revisit something that we thought would be covered in a previous year, maybe they've come from somewhere else and haven't been exposed to those ideas. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and when we're teaching conceptually, they are shifting to being the thinkers. And so this means that when they're looking at their case studies, they're looking for the patterns and they can start to build that understanding for themselves.
Yeah, I'll never forget being in a maths class once. Was actually when my husband David was teaching a lesson, and the student had come from just building his generalisation, and he sat back in his chair and went, mind blown. And this was a kid who was really strong in mathematics, but just never thought about fractions in that way. He discovered this new relationship and absolutely had the ownership of having discovered that for himself. So it was just so exciting to see the joy on his face as like, whoa, I had no idea that that was true of fractions. So.
I had such a similar situation with a student when we were looking at the relationship between fractions and division. And literally he was sitting there and he slammed his hands down on the table and you said, "You have to be joking me."
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. Is it that simple? So it was just taking the time to unpack that thinking, giving them the time to see the connections and not tell them the connections, allow them to explore those connections for themselves. That is just so powerful for them, but also as a teacher, so rewarding. Because you see that aha moment and you just go, yes, that's why I teach.
That is what we're here for. Yeah, so exciting.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, Kelvin, what's the role of practice in a concept-based inquiry maths program?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it goes back to, if you like, the history of how we've taught the subject. Because when we didn't know how to teach conceptually, or we didn't have the mathematical content knowledge as teachers to teach conceptually, then we would often fall back on procedural approaches. You know, cross out the 3, carry the 1, bring down the 7. Everyone remembers their own little sayings from the past. And the problem with that is we're actually not understanding. As we said, it's a conceptual language, and if we're not understanding, then we're actually not doing mathematics. We also know from research that human beings have not evolved to memorize procedures. We're just not good at it because it didn't have survival value. And so if you're not good at learning procedures, you then have to have lots of repetitive practice, which goes a long way to explaining the common diet in a lot of classrooms, which is repetitive practice. And you've done that, okay, here's another sheet, and so on.
And in some classrooms, repetitive practice at speed.
Yes, well that's an even greater complication, because that upsets all sorts of motivational aspects, and anxiety creeps in, and that's the last thing you need when you're trying to think in higher and higher abstract levels. But what we have evolved to do well is to develop conceptual schemas, so networks of understandings that join up and make sense, because we've built them ourselves, as you were saying, Dani. And those, we now have research showing that those not only take up a little space in our memory, even though they're complex schemas, but they can be accessed easily, and any part of that network can be accessed quickly and efficiently, and then used in whatever problems you're solving or whatever situation across the curriculum that you're looking at.
Human brain is incredible.
It's amazing. So when we're teaching conceptually, it may take longer than it did to teach a procedure. And we're happy with that because we're building those durable, complex schemas of understanding where the students know their way around this network of ideas. So although that may take longer in the initial phase, because we're building those networks that really transfer easily into practice, we actually need less practice to reach the same level of proficiency, because it's based on the basic part of human life, which is understanding.
And it saves time further down the track.
Yeah, it made me think about what you were saying earlier, Dani, where you said, but the next year students had no idea that we'd taught that before, or that they had been exposed to that, and you sort of say, oh, do you remember doing this last year? And they go, no, and you know for sure that they were taught that last year. So that need for reteaching is eliminated. We spend a bit longer up front making sure that they've understood, but we don't have to keep reteaching over and over again.
And it's also the same for even in that year when they can make the connection to that related concept, and they have that moment of, didn't we already do this? And it's, no, we're building upon that. But straight away when they've said that, you know that they've made that connection. And you can see them building that language that comes into something that's completely new, but it's like that's already familiar for them. And for those students who really, have a poor maths disposition especially, they start to feel more confident because they feel like they've got somewhere to stand. They feel confident in this part of the understanding, therefore I can start there. And it then brings life to that whole start with what you know. And they can leverage from there.
It's important to stress though that doesn't mean that practice isn't important, but it's practice for fluency rather than practice for understanding. And that's the key difference, that we're developing the practice for understanding. So a lot of the practice that we've built into our resources are where we're asking the students to transfer their understanding to a novel or unfamiliar or different context, where the understanding, they have to carry that with them and do the intellectual work of applying that understanding, and that reinforces, because it's meaningful practice. It's not just that blind, repetitive practice that we all remember from our own schooling experiences.
And it's really consolidating their learning when they're seeing it in a new or novel context versus just more of the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember spending pages and pages of the textbook were same thing, just different pictures on the side. We're doing this again today, and let's practice again for the next hour. So, yeah.
And it reinforces that concepts do transfer. That's their power, whereas facts are locked in place and time, as we all know.
Absolutely. Dani, why do you think it seems harder particularly for primary or elementary teachers, to design concept-based mathematics units when they've designed other concept-based units of inquiry, but when it comes to maths, there seems to be a reluctance, it takes longer, or some schools never even attempt it. They'll teach concept-based in other areas of the curriculum, but when it comes to maths, they go back to a really factual, procedural approach.
Yeah, I think that comes back to us as teachers and how we learned. So when I went through school, we were given a process and we repeated the process, and there was very little understanding that went with that. Some students were really lucky to be able to form their own understanding through that, but if they were anything like me, I was not able to do that. So I was just repeating something and I wasn't really understanding that. So then as a teacher coming in, and for me teaching at a year 6 level, I was picking up a textbook and going, okay, what do I do here? So for me, maths wasn't a strong point initially, so I retaught myself from more of an understanding perspective. So for teachers teaching maths, they often don't have the understanding to facilitate the discussion and the questions and to guide them to the understanding for their students. And that can be really hard. And it's not a fault of their own, it's just how we learned. And we know now that that's not going to work for everybody. So having something like the concept-based approach, the maths program, provides teachers with not only a tool to teach their own students, to build their own students towards an understanding, but through that process they're building their own. They're not expected to think of the questions. They're not expected to just magic this understanding and go, yeah, this is what they need to know. We're giving them that, and it's about giving teachers the tools to be able to support students, because concept-based inquiry is so intentional. And if we want our students to be thinkers, we as teachers need to be thinkers. But if we have nothing foundational or very little foundational to stand on, it can be tricky. So that's where a tool, a resource that supports that is really helpful. And primary school teachers especially, they have a full curriculum to teach and they're time poor. So we know that, like what Kelvin was saying, concept-based approach, it does take time.
Oh, absolutely.
So where we can support teachers to not only build their own understanding, but build their students' understanding, that's a really important resource.
And I remember my daughter, who was probably 7 or 8 at the time, coming home and saying, Mum, how does the teacher know what to write on the board? And I said, what do you mean, honey? And she goes, well, they spend all day with us in the classroom. How do they know what they're going to write on the board tomorrow? It was really insightful of her, for quite a young child to be wondering
Very
that.
thoughtful.
Yeah, and her father is a teacher, so she sees him in the classroom. She was kind of thinking about, well, where is the time for teachers? And Kelvin, you sent me some research a little while ago about it, and I think it described teaching as the curriculum lottery for students, and this idea that basically the maths or the literacy that students will be exposed to really comes down to what teachers have time to develop, what they can access. And we did very much take away a lot of textbooks from teachers, but without putting something back into place.
Right.
Think about the number of hours that's gone into planning the concept-based mathematics project. Even the best maths teachers would take years to be developing that on their own. It took us years to develop it. And so, you know, that idea of a school going, right, we're going to build this. Well, you absolutely can, but it was a 4-year journey for us. And typically, in my experience, when schools are building curriculum, they have a year to do maths, and then the next year they're doing literacy. In fact, I was talking to a school recently who said in the next 6 months we have to have a new maths curriculum, a new literacy curriculum, new science curriculum, and new social studies curriculum. And I said, and are you going to be teaching in the next 6 months? Yeah, absolutely. You know, the principal has decided that we don't have the curriculum in place and needs it by the end of the year. And I was just like, wow. And it's a huge, yeah, indeed. You're not going to be able to build quality curriculum. And the original idea for this project came about from my own experience of, we spent a year writing maths curriculum, but the next year we spent a year writing literacy curriculum, and where's the time for implementation? So the idea here is that the curriculum is written, the learning engagements are written, we can now spend our time and energy focusing on the teaching. Yeah.
And a really good part of this program is that it gives the teacher some instructions too. It's not just learning engagements. There is a specific part of this curriculum that is targeted to the teacher to support them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are the kinds of responses you might expect. So right through it, there's a column for this is what we'd be saying to students, and another column for this is some information for you as background to why this has been designed in this way. But we also designed it as possible learning engagements. So right back when we started, you said, look, I don't know if we feel comfortable designing this. So many teachers will want more agency than that. And it's also written in such a way that you could take the understandings and the questions and change out the learning experiences. If you're really passionate about teaching maths and you're really confident and you've got 20 years worth of resources for teaching mathematics, then fit them in and see, what's the purpose of this learning engagement, how would it fit into these understandings.
It's the beauty of a concept-based approach, because the understandings transfer. So
it
doesn't matter about the learning engagement as long as it's a good example of that understanding. That's great.
If the questions guide, and that's where we had to spend a lot of time getting that guidance right. So imagine people who are not necessarily comfortable with the subject, knowing how to guide. That was another thing that, we spent a lot of time getting those guiding questions from factual through to eventually to the conceptual questions. So that's another key part for me of this whole approach. It's structured, but there's flexibility within it. There's sample learning engagements, not you must. And so, quite a few teachers that I'm working with at the moment are saying, no, we're following every word until we know it. And others are saying, oh yeah, no, I like that, I can see where that's going, but I'd plug this in there instead. And it's like, perfect. If we can reach both of those constituencies, then we will have done well.
It's building teacher capacity.
Knowing the variety of teachers, the diversity that teachers bring with them, let alone the diversity that kids walk through the door with.
The other thing we see all too often with mathematics, sadly, is I was talking to a maths coordinator recently who said, I've got one classroom that every day spend 45 minutes to an hour on maths at another classroom that have 25 minutes in the same grade. And it was purely down to teachers' confidence. Didn't feel confident teaching maths, so the amount of time that students spend learning maths in that classroom was less than half. And think about what that adds up to over the year. These kids are then going to get mixed together the following year, and because the teacher didn't have confidence, students just weren't experiencing maths in the same way. All right, Kelvin, you were involved. I remember well, multiple conversations actually, over a few years around the idea of should we be designing this in terms of grade levels or phases. And we went back and forth a bit and actually ended up somewhere in the middle. And we decided to really think intentionally about what would be the advantages and disadvantages, why would we do that. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I remember that process really well, because we were aware, as all teachers are, that the implications of a phase approach are considerable for a teacher in terms of organisation, preparation and managing the time and the different groups. But what happened was we started off, Rachel and I, writing the scope and sequence. So the understandings, that took a long time but was very fulfilling and rewarding, and probably isn't totally finished because we keep saying
We continue to refine.
we write another one this week.
Yeah.
To plug in somewhere, just to add a little gap that appeared. But we had written the scope and sequence and we were relatively happy with it as a working document. And then we started writing by grade levels, aware that we thought we could differentiate satisfactorily, as we had done. You know, everyone's possibly doing subtraction, but there are multiple levels at which you could, entry points for students that we could manage. But as we looked, for the first time in my case, and this hasn't really been done systematically before, when we looked at the understandings, the thought that we could have all the kids in one class being guided towards one understanding or the same understandings, we just said to ourselves, that doesn't gel with what we know about the diversity of students' backgrounds and ability levels.
Well, there's been a lot of research.
Well, there is now, yeah. There's research that says that in any primary classroom, even in primary, you can have up to 6 years range in ability in the students that walk through the door. And so it was looking at the generalizations, looking at the understandings and saying there's no way I can expect students across that 6-year range to all focus on that understanding. We said we're going to have to bite on the bullet. And then the question was, so how many phases do we have and how do we map the phases to the grade levels? So it became a really key part of what we're doing. And the other corollary, if you like, was that if we're going to, especially in the number strands, which is probably where the greatest differentiation, range of ability is in number. When we think, you say that to most classroom teachers, they'll say, it's number, not so much geometry or shape and space or statistics and probability. But if we're going to do that in number, in the number strands, then we need to have really good data to base that decision on. And while there were some really good examples of pre-assessments from different parts of the world that we looked at, we felt that most pre-assessments weren't designed to elicit understanding. They were designed to show performance of a skill or recitation of some knowledge. So then, having made the decision to move to phases in the number strands, we said, right, we're going to have to come up with some really good examples of open-ended questions that allow students to draw or write or explain or show some of the richness of their understanding rather than just, can you do 2-digit multiplication, something like that. So that was the next challenge, and it was really, really good for us because we were, again, pulling on how do we ask questions, because obviously we can't have everything one-on-one. We can't interview every single student for every single topic we teach. So how can we come up with some kind of a variety of formats that allow students the room and the freedom and the encouragement to show their understanding, and then we can map those results to the understandings in the scope and sequence. So we've tried to give teachers a pre-assessment that opens that possibility to show what you know. And in every case it says, show everything you understand about this topic. You can draw, you can write, you can do diagrams, which again will be new for lots of students, but we know that those same students will welcome that opportunity. Some may be a bit a bit in awe at the start. Others will say, at last you've asked me, and they'll really give us a lot to work with. But yeah, that knock-on effect of having to then come up with some pre-assessments that do credit to the understandings that we've written, that was a key part that I'm really looking forward to hearing feedback from schools about how well that's going.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Dani, you've had the opportunity to try some of the units as you were developing them in your classroom. What impact has that had on students?
The impact has been that I've seen a shift in student confidence most affirmingly. So having students develop understanding and taking that time to really strip it back and allow them to develop their own understanding allows for those aha moments. And as a teacher, that's what you live for.
Yes.
So having the comments like, oh, Miss B, you just make this maths as something that I can understand now. And I always put it back on them. Well, actually, this isn't about me. This is about you. You're seeing the patterns and you're building your own understanding there. So the aha moments are definitely the best moments. Like I mentioned before, it's building those connections.
Yes.
You talked about them building across the year, but what I've really noticed is them building them within the year level as well, and being able to draw back on the thinking that they've done right at the start of term 1, coming into term 3. They can see how converting between units of measure is very much related to the place value system, and they can see how that builds. So it's the connections that they make, it's the aha moments, which really, and the confidence in what they have in themselves as a mathematician is really exciting, because maths disposition is something that I think for teachers is often very noticeable and can sometimes be the reason why students switch off to maths. Is often the reason why students switch off to maths. So being able to build that confidence from their own understanding is great.
Oh, incredible. Well, we're excited to be able to get this out into the world. So thank you both for meeting with me today, but also thank you both for your commitment and dedication to this process over the past many years.
Very welcome. Thank you for taking the initiative to do it, to be honest. It'll be a very good investment.
It's been a huge, and to be part of something that is doing what hasn't been there before.
Yeah.
That third dimension of the curriculum, to be part of that is just still awesome for me.